auricle. The pinna or the auricle is formed from a series of swellings or hillocks. Ow. They are formed from, the pinna or the auricle is formed from a series of swellings or hillocks from the first and second arches. Okay, these are also lined by ectoderm. So this forms the auricle or the pinna or the external ear. The second arch, okay, the second arch, the ectodermal part of it grows at a rapid rate. It overgrows all the other arches, the ectodermal lining of the other arches, and it grows downwards. Okay, now it grows downwards and it overhangs the third, fourth and the sixth developing arches. Okay, so it grows rapidly and it overhangs the lower arches, that is the third, fourth and sixth. There is a space between this hanging overgrowth and the third, fourth, sixth arches, and this space is called cervical sinus. It's called cervical sinus. This cervical sinus usually gets obliterated. Okay, the cavity of the cervical sinus usually gets obliterated, but if it persists, if this cavity persists, you will find swelling along the anterior border of the sternocleidomastoid muscle. You will find swellings along the sternocleidomastoid muscle. This muscle comes from the lateral part below the ear, from the styloid process right down to the clavicle. Sternocleidomastoid muscle. So you will find swellings if there is a persistence of the cavity of the cervical sinus along this, the anterior border of the sternocleidomastoid muscle. Okay, and these are called branchial cysts. These are called branchial cysts. The commonest site of occurrence is along the angle of the mandible. It's along the angle of the mandible. Okay, that's the commonest site. Now, if the cavity opens onto the ectoderm, if there's a cavity from the ectoderm, there's a passage, a false passage from the outside, from the ectoderm up to that persisting branchial cyst, it's called a branchial sinus. It's called a branchial sinus. These are the embryological remnants of the cervical sinus. These can get infected. That is why you need to remember them. Apart from the fact that they are the embryological remnants of the of the cervical sinus. Okay, so this is the applied anatomy of the cervical sinus and the branchial cysts. These show you the ectodermal clefts, okay, and the overgrowing or the rapidly growing second ectodermal part of the arch. Okay, from the second arch you have the rapid growth of the ectodermal part downwards. Okay, see the projection growing downwards from the second arch. It comes down. As it comes down, it overhangs third, fourth, sixth arches. Okay, there is a space which develops between the overhanging part of the second arch and third, fourth, sixth arches. This space is called cervical sinus. Cervical sinus lying deep to the downward projection from the second arch. This space is called cervical sinus. Embryologically, this should disappear, but if the cavity of the cervical sinus persists, then it forms a swelling along the anterior border of the sternocleidomastoid muscle, and these are called branchial cysts. If there is a false passage existing from the ectoderm up to the branchial cyst, it's called a branchial sinus. So this is the importance of these cervical sinuses. Let's now look at the fate of the endodermal part of these branchial pouches. Okay, the fate of the endodermal pouches. They actually participate in the formation of several important organs related to the ear and the roof of the mouth cavity. Okay, so you have the first pouch. It has two parts, a ventral part and a dorsal part. Ventral part is obliterated by formation of tongue. Anterior or ventral part is obliterated by formation of the tongue. Dorsal part has a proximal part and a distal part. Okay, the dorsal part has a proximal and a distal part. Dorsal part gives rise to the tubotympanic recess. Tubotympanic recess of the middle ear cavity. Dorsal part of the first pouch gives rise to tubotympanic recess of the middle ear cavity. Now the proximal part gives rise to auditory tube or the pharyngotympanic tube or the eustachian tube. Now the purpose of this eustachian tube is to equalize the pressures outside, that is exterior, and the throat, okay, in the middle ear cavity and the throat. There is an extension between these two, okay, and this is called the auditory tube, pharyngotympanic tube or the eustachian tube. Okay, now the distal part gives rise to middle ear cavity itself, including the tympanic antrum. Okay, now this is the first pouch. When you come to the second pouch, this also has two parts, a ventral part and a dorsal part. Ventral part gives rise to the epithelium which participates in formation of the tonsil of the pharynx. Okay, the dorsal part gives rise to the tubotympanic recess again. It participates in formation of the tubotympanic recess. The third pouch gives rise to the inferior parathyroid glands and the thymus. Okay, whereas the fourth pouch gives rise to superior parathyroid glands and the thyroid gland. Please notice that fourth pouch gives superior parathyroid glands, whereas the upper pouch, that is the third pouch, gives the lower parathyroid glands, that is inferior parathyroid glands. Third pouch also gives rise to the thymus gland, which is very important in children, and it is known for maturation of the T lymphocytes. That's why they're called T lymphocytes, okay, which are responsible for the immunity of the body. Fourth pouch also participates in the formation of the thyroid gland, an important endocrine gland. Fifth pouch, okay, it's very controversial, but you need to know the name. Fifth pouch is also called ultimobranchial pouch, the role of which is controversial, but you need to know the name of the fifth pouch. This picture shows you the fate of the endodermal pouches. Now they participate in the formation of several important organs. The first pouch has a ventral part and a dorsal part. Okay, ventral part is obliterated by formation of the tongue, whereas the dorsal part participates in formation of tubotympanic recess. Okay, the anterior part of this tubotympanic recess, the proximal part, gives rise to eustachian tube or auditory tube. Eustachian tube or auditory tube. This normalizes or equalizes the pressure in the middle ear cavity and the throat. Okay, that is the exterior of the throat, which opens into the mouth, which has atmospheric pressure. Okay, so the proximal part gives rise to auditory tube or the eustachian tube, whereas the distal part gives rise to middle ear cavity, including the tympanic antrum. Second pouch also has a dorsal and a ventral part. The ventral part goes to form the epithelium of the tonsil, okay, and the dorsal part again contributes in the formation of tubotympanic recess here. Okay, then you have the third pouch, which gives rise to inferior parathyroid glands and the thymus. Third pouch gives rise to upper elements, that is the third pouch gives rise to the lower elements, that is the inferior parathyroid glands and the thymus gland, whereas the fourth pouch gives rise to superior elements, that is the superior parathyroid glands and even the thyroid gland, okay, the lateral lobe of the thyroid gland. Okay, so these are the formation of several organs from the endodermal pouches. Yes, from the endodermal pouches.